Good evening and welcome to the latest in the New Books in the Arts and Sciences series. Today celebrating Jack Halberstam's new book, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, from Duke University Press. My name's Alan Stewart. I'm chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature. And it's my great pleasure to be here with my colleague Jack and three esteemed panelists to discuss this great new book. I want to thank the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, under whose auspices this occasion is taking place, and also to register the support of the Office of the Divisional Deans in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality, EARWAGS, and the Department of English and Comparative Literature. And also to thank Eileen Galuli, Kelly McKinney, and Kay Zong for their work behind the scenes on this event. So for those of you who haven't been to one of these events before, what happens is I shall introduce our speakers, and then Jack will talk about the book for a few minutes and then pass on to each of them in turn. At the end of that, Jack will have the possibility of speaking back to any of the remarks, and then we'll move to a Q&A. And the Q&A will be done with questions. If you submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, we will read them and try and fit as many in as we can. If you want me to read your question out, just write a question. If you want to speak live, then put the word live in and we will try and call on you as best we can. Okay, so to introduce our speaker, Jack Halberstam is Professor of English and Comparative Literature and Director of EARWAGS here at Columbia. He's the author of 7 books, which look like queer studies of the last 30 years. Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender and the End of Normal, and Trans, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variance. Jack's latest book, published by Duke, is Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, and he's now finishing a second volume on wildness titled The Wild Beyond, Music, Architecture, and Anarchy. Jack was the winner of the 2018 Arcus Places Prize from Places Journal for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment. Tavia Nyong'o is Chair and Professor of Theatre and Performance Studies, Professor of American Studies, and Professor of African American Studies at Yale University. His research and teaching interests span Black queer cultural and performance studies, contemporary art and aesthetic theory, speculative genres, Afrofuturism, and Black sound studies. He's the author of The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Ruses of Memory in 2009, and Afrofabulations, the Queer Drama of Black Life in 2018. Joseph Alvanas is Assistant Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. He specializes in the literature of the Romantic period, especially poetry, and the legacies of Romanticism across a number of theoretical and critical domains. His current book project traces new formations of community, ecology, and the everyday in Romantic literature, and its 20th century and contemporary afterlives. And Audra Simpson is Professor of Anthropology at Columbia. Her research and writing is rooted within Indigenous polities in the US and Canada, and crosses the fields of anthropology, Indigenous studies, American and Canadian studies, gender and sexuality studies, as well as politics. She's the author of Mohawk Interruptus, Political Life Across the Borders of Settler States. So please welcome our speakers, and I'll hand back to Jack.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm so grateful to Audra, Tavia, and Joe for agreeing to meet and discuss this book on wildness. And thank you, Alan, for moderating. So in my time, just to sort of set up some of the claims of the book, I'm just going to offer 5 ideas from the book about the category of wildness. And so the first claim really that I make is that we all sort of have a sense of what wildness is, because we've all been well trained by a kind of colonial mindset in which a civilizational discourse comes to save us from the wild and from the peoples that populate the wild and are defined by, savagery and by their distance from a civilized order. But apart from serving this kind of negative category in relationship to civilization, I propose, and we'll see how successful this proposal is, that wildness can exceed this negative function. And by exceeding that negative function, it can both offer a critique of civilizational discourses on the one hand, and on the other hand, it can begin to tear away at what Foucault called the order of things and dig into a kind of disorder that unites all kinds of groups, from queer people to indigenous populations, and the way in which Black populations have been perceived within civilizing orders. So wildness, we'll see whether this holds up, but it's possible that wildness holds within it a very different way of associating group identities. There's a version of this narrative that I'm telling about the wild in a children's book, from which my title is taken, by Maurice Sendak, that many people, at least in the US, are raised on this book. And I think that the allegory that Sendak's children's book lays out is a kind of blueprint for my book. And so it's basically telling us that, of course, it's a little boy. It's a little boy rebels against the domestic nuclear family, the heterosexual household, and most particularly the mother, and journeys off to find another place where he does not have to come under the sway of the domestic. He finds this other place, and it is, very specifically a place of wildness. And as the colonial traveler that he is, he decides that he will be the king of the wild things. But that proves to be as dissatisfying as being the subject in the domestic home. And so he leaves and goes home. The question that the book sort of leaves us with, though, is what is the wild to the wild things? Okay, we know what the wild is to the little boy who escapes the domestic home, but what is the wild to everyone else who is not the small colonial traveler? And is it just a place of ruination, or are there other possibilities for life there? And in some ways, that's the question that my book pursues. Okay, so the second claim I make is a simple claim, which is, if we agree with Foucault that there is an order of things, and that order of things was established by a mania for classification and expertise that comes up around the 18th century, then there must also be at least the remnant of a disorder of things. And it's that disordering set of knowledges that my book seeks to pursue. The disorder of things is also part of what Sylvia Winters called the coloniality of being. And it's a disorder that is ascribed racially to particular groups and is contained in relationship to those groups. And the order of things then lives on within this civilizing mission that is taken up by canonical literatures and aesthetics. So this second point that I'm after is, if wildness is the disorder of things, where do we find the archive of disorder? What does it look like? And the answer for me, weirdly, was that it sometimes actually appears in the canon of what has been designated as the great tradition, but it bursts out of this canon and produces other kinds of aesthetics. So that takes me to point number 3 then. What other kinds of aesthetics does the pursuit of wildness lead us to? And in a chapter on, of all things, Rite of Spring, and this is where you kind of see this volley back and forth between a kind of canonical set of aesthetic practices and then the wild response to that aesthetic. In relationship to that text, I argue for an aesthetic of bewilderment. And bewilderment is one of those great terms. I mean, it holds literally the wild within it, bewilderment, to become wild. But in earlier moments in its etymology, bewilderment meant getting lost. And in that sense, it sort of opens onto what you might call another kind of knowledge, or an anti-epistemology, something that wants to push back on knowledge and find its way to being lost. But it's also, bewilderment is also something that wants to confuse and contest. And that's what we find in this series that I trace of responses to the rite of spring, coming from the work that I pursue here in this chapter is Kent Monkman. Kent Monkman is a queer Canadian Swampy Cree two-spirit artist who in his work has literally painted a response to European modernism. And there is barely a painting in Kent Monkman's oeuvre that is not a response to modernism and to a particular history of fine art that has been told. In one particular performance, however, he offers a response to Rite of Spring. And I originally sort of got interested in Rite of Spring as this kind of very interesting queer collaboration between Nijinsky, Stravinsky, and Diaghilev, all of whom were sleeping with each other. And then were producing this crazy ballet/symphony about a fertility rite of all things, right? A fertility rite in which the women and the men are never on the stage at the same time. And I was sort of content with that. But as I dug into the history of Rite of Spring, I realized that when the audience responded in a very charged and disruptive way to the original performance in 1913, one of the things they were responding to was the fact that they could hear in the music and see in the ballet the disruptive presence of an indigenous gestural vocabulary that had been lifted and appropriated both in the music and in the ballet. What Ken Monkman does is he responds very directly to the appropriations that make up Rite of Spring. And in 2008, he performed a dance in response to a George Catlin painting titled Dance of the Berdache. And in response to the painting, he produced a whole set of performative canvases that were produced from buffalo hide, and he performed in his alter ego of Mischief Eagle Testicle. And the music that he performed to was created by an Indigenous Canadian musician and was based upon Rite of Spring. So I used that response to Rite of Spring to suggest that bewilderment is not, its aesthetic completion comes around when the person who has been designated, or the group that's been designated as wild, is able to speak back through the canon and in the process dismantle it. Okay, just two more points so that I can move aside here. In the book turns in its second half, there's a sort of pivot chapter, and the pivot chapter, and here's my falcon in the background, the pivot chapter is on an epistemology of the ferox. And obviously an epistemology of the ferox draws heavily on Eve Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet. For Sedgwick, modern systems of knowing depend heavily upon the homo-hetero binary and upon a binary of secrecy and revelation. I propose, along with many other people who have contested this as the only kind of significant binary, that the domestic wild binary is as significant to our understanding of desire. And to bolster that claim, I explore a weird subgenre of writing by mostly gay men from the middle of the last century involving falcon narratives. And an incomplete account of this subgenre would include The Peregrine by J.A. Baker, 1967, Glenway Westcott's Pilgrim Hawk, 1940, Robert Duncan's poem, My Mother Would Be a Falconress, 1968, Genius Child, Langston Hughes, 1937, a 1968 book by Barry Hines called A Kestrel for a Knave, and so on. This topic is taken up most recently, however, by Helen MacDonald, who includes in her book, H is for Hawk, an account of T.H. White, who wrote The Goshawk in 1939, in which he tells his story of trying to and failing to train a hawk. And she says his inability to train his hawk is indicative of his inability to tame his gay desire. My argument, however, is that he's not just sublimating his queerness. He is actually interested in the hawk. And what he sees in the hawk that he wants his desire to rest upon is the fact that the hawk is always feral, no matter how much it is trained. And feral, rather than wild, feral means something that can never be tamed, not something that can be tamed and then returns to the wild, something that can never be tamed. And T.H. White says, the word feral had a kind of magical potency, and it allied itself with two other words, ferocious, free, and then he gives more words, fairy, a queer word, fey, also a queer word, aerial, and other discreditable alliances, which he said range themselves behind the great cord of ferox. So my question in that chapter is, what if we organize our understanding of desire in relationship to the ferox rather than the closet? To close out the book, I turn to the zombie as a figure of the untamed, the wild, the irrepressible, the id, but also the zombie as it appears in shows like The Walking Dead, is quite clearly an amalgamation of racialized others, including African Americans and most obviously indigenous peoples. And there's a kind of interesting, restless vengefulness that emerges within zombie fantasies that are of, I think, should be of great interest to us. And I follow Jodie Bird in thinking about how the zombie plays out an imperialist narrative within which the indigenous figure is part of a living death, okay? But the other figure in this book, and this is where I'm going to end, is the pet, the family pet. And this is probably where the book turns from a kind of semi-literary, exploration of wildness to a probably deeply annoying polemic against pet owning. And I'm open to your questions, comments, and objections, but I leave you with the idea that the zombie you live with is your cat, your dog, your fish. It is the form of the wild that you have taken into your home, domesticated, and in the process told yourself that you are a great person for bestowing love upon this creature. So the wild, within that analogy is the place in which the human against which the human exercises its dominion. So I will stop there and pass off to Joseph. Thank you.
I think actually it's Tavia next. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm up. Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Jack, and actually thank you for the book as well. I'm really excited to think alongside you and this panel. So I typically read, but in honor of Jack, I will be winging it today. So if I go over, someone will stop me. My response is entitled "Getting Wild." I'll start just by showing this image of a syllabus on wildness that I co-taught with the late Jose Munoz, who's mentioned in Jack's book, and he talks about the ways in which this project started as a kind of three-way conversation amongst the three of us. And one of the things I'll just pull out from that early conversation, that early class with Jose in 2013, is that for him, the turn to the wild was a way of asking the question of what happens when we put the queer in queer studies in brackets, to place it in suspension, if not under erasure. And I think that we sort of see a version of that coming to fruition in Wild Things, which of course does not entirely put queerness under erasure, but takes it apart, brings it and puts it back together in ways that are very, very novel and exciting, and maybe necessary for our moment. I'm going to focus on 4 ways in which I see the book doing this, thinking about queer theory and climate collapse, thinking about the coloniality of being and what it might mean to be outside, underneath, or beyond that, recasting the language of vulnerability, which is sort of endemic and perhaps endemic in a disabling way in queer studies, and then also closing out with darkness, pessimism, and unworlding, which are themes that come up throughout the text, and where I kind of have a question actually for Jack when we get to conversation, if we do. In this quote that I'll from early in the book, which I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but it's a quote that reminds me the way in which wildness as a concept is very immediately polysemous for Jack, right? That it's neither bad nor good, it's neither cause nor effect, it's neither past nor necessarily to come. And so the question becomes, so what is it? Where is it, right? You kind of want to get a hold of it and place it in a taxonomy. And that, I think, is precisely the point, that you can't. But there's still a use for it in the sense that there is a need for what he calls here new lexicons of the post-natural world. And that wildness, as I read it at least, is a kind of placeholder for this new lexicon, right? In that lexicon, perhaps is the ferox, right? In that lexicon, perhaps is the zombie. In that lexicon, and perhaps are there many other other names for the shapes of bodily legibility and illegibility. And whereas this, these new terms, what they do, at least for me, is resuscitate. I'm going to use zombie metaphors, reanimate the sort of no future debates in queer studies, but in a different way. So whereas for a critic like Lee Edelman, no future, is specifically about the name queer, right? And the way in which queerness is a kind of anti-naturalism. For Halberstam, nature itself is no longer good, right? And so the no future in this text is actually the default operating mode of extractivist capitalist society and its command and control of the future. So when he calls for a queer theory after nature, it is something that is, as he says, on the side of chaos. And we might think of the way in which this chaos works differently than the kind of chiasmus, as it does in a kind of older version of the queer as neatly chiasmic with the natural. So I'll just leave that out quickly so that I can stay within my time. But the second way in which I think the text is an intervention or expansion of what queerness can mean or do is in its engagement with the coloniality of being, to use a phrase from Sylvia Wynter. And this is, I'm sure we'll be talking about the ways in which the term wild is deeply complicit, right, in civilizational, imperialist, white supremacist, and capitalist logics of conquest and control, right? So why is it nevertheless a useful term to retain or perhaps even to champion under certain circumstances? I think that the way the book addresses this is by really delving deeply and lingering in the entanglement of both queerness and wildness in colonialism, right? So that it's able to ask, what if we are not the authors of a revolution, right? But what if we are the masters who must be overthrown? I think that's a quote from 162. And so what this allows us to do is to approach the desire for wildness, which Jack has just outlined, not simply as the sort of answer, right? The quick fix, the thing that we can kind of get behind as a slogan, but as actually part of the overrepresentation of man, right? And I think the diatribe against pet owning fits into this, but I'll leave that for the conversation, except to say that part of what that diatribe does within the book is to sort of look at all the different ways in which the desire for the wild actually extends the carceral reach of the human, right? And that wherever we land on sort of pet owning, right, we may want to be alert to all the ways in which we reproduce the coloniality of being. And this is really not a sense of a kind of caveat, so we kind of get past in order to get to the wild and embrace and enjoy it, right? But actually to sort of linger with, I'll say maybe, wild is, wild ain't, right? There's a way in which there's a kind of desire for the wild in the text that we see in the reading of the falcon and the hawk, the epistemology of the ferox, but then there's also this like deep critique of the companionate species, right? And the ways in which it actually might extend versions of carceral humanism. And we may pick different examples, right? We may prefer dogs to hawks or vice versa, but the larger point is, I think, taken. So moving quickly to my third point, one of the things that I find interesting about this turn to the wild is what it allows us to do in terms of recasting vulnerability. And here, feminist, queer, trans politics and theory is perpetually engaged in a kind of generational struggle over language and terminology in all, which I think is a kind of way that misrecognizes misrecognition, right? Because it holds in it this belief that if we just get our language right, not only will we recognize each other, right, but we'll be able to kind of get over the past, right? And so there's a kind of, I think I've heard Jack use this in the press in other contexts, a coloniality of the present, right? Which actually divests ourselves from the deep histories that actually produce the present, right? But also imagine a kind of normalizing search for a perfect or adequate language. And so the very fact that the wild is maybe not the thing that we want to sort of embrace immediately or easily in any straightforward fashion is itself useful actually in this juncture, right? And I think that the text's interest in theorists like Jane Bennett, Eduardo Kohn, and others who investigate non-human language is not just, again, not as idiosyncratic, but a deeply important search for a way of thinking about language that doesn't center the human being and that grounds language in a different sense of vulnerability, right? So rather than, I mean, this does relate, I think, to maybe, Judith Butler's notion of a precarious life, right? But maybe we could also, but I think extending that beyond actually even life, right? If we think of language as something that is not centered around the human, not centered around animacy hierarchy, as Mel Chen places it, then the vulnerability to destruction, to being eaten, right, is a very, very different a language of vulnerability than the kind of biopolitical language of transhumanism, which is a term that he engages in the text. And I just had to put the most prominent transhumanist Martine Rothblatt on the slide as an example of the kind of biopolitical effort to make the world safe for ourselves, which in ourselves is always the sort of most privileged, the most powerful, the wealthiest. I mean, we've seen how the billionaire class has doubled or tripled or quadrupled its wealth in the last year, while everyone else has been debilitated or debted, I suppose, right, by the pandemic, right? So it's very, very kind of serious to sort of unthink our kind of habituated notions that vulnerability has to be attached to making us more and more, to enter more and more people into the charm circle of the human, right? And then, so the last part of my comment is to think about an ambiguity in the wild, where wildness is, in the early part of the book, named as queerly vital. And this, again, ties back to kind of the Jane Bennett and the Branca, Arsic, and maybe I think the Munoz as well, all thinkers of vitalism, right? Which is a kind of extension of life beyond the living as we normally see it, right? But it also, as the book goes on and progresses, it aligns wildness, again, as I said, with chaos, and also with the kind of unworlding that it associates through Afro-pessimism with a version of Black studies. And so the figure of the zombie, in addition to being a figure of indigeneity, is also a figure of Blackness, right? And of Africanness. And as a figure of living death, sort of associates directly with a kind of conversation around social death, right? And so it's key, I think, to a dialogue that the book wants to have with Black pessimism and nihilism. And I would venture to say horrorism in particular. And so in closing, I just picked this one reading the book offers of the television series In the Flesh, which is a text, an archive that Jack and I have in common. And I actually love the reading of the series, but it does leave me with a question that I'll end with, right? Which is that, Jack uses In the Flesh to read against the kind of dominant zombie narrative of our present, which is The Walking Dead, in which a kind of militarized cowboy hero takes on the zombies, right? And sort of inverts that by imagining a suicided gay man who's been brought involuntarily back to life by human biopolitics. In other words, someone who's sort of like rejected this world, right? And then has to sort of confront an attempt to sort of domesticate, to bring the wild zombie into the domestic. And, for Halberstam, this is a particular zombie narrative that, in taking the perspective of the zombies, allows us to think about a kind of much more radical unworlding than is typically the case in zombie narratives, right? So by caveat to this reading, and this neat inversion, right, of the notion of living death, right? The living death is not being a zombie. The living death is actually being like a gay teen in suburban England, right? The unbearable organization of the normative. Is that, of course, as Jack knows, one of the core tenets of Afro-pessimism is that Blackness is not analogizable to anything else, not even queerness, right? And so social death in Afro-pessimist terms is not living death. And I myself have been taken to task by Afro-pessimists for conflating darkness with Blackness, right? So where does this leave us, right? And I think on the one hand, the book is right that there's a real something to be pursued by this sort of way in which both Edelman and maybe an Afro-pessimist like Calvin Warren are both generative in terms of their sense of kind of negativity and the no future, but also limiting in that they kind of both want to remain within a kind of Heideggerian, Lacanian, European philosophical anti-humanism. So in a certain kind of way, both Afro-pessimism and a certain kind of queer anti-relationality is still not necessarily humanist, but still committed to a sort of kind of philosophical archive. And Wild Things really wants to push beyond that. But it leaves me with the question as to whether or not that beyond, that exceeding of the negative as we know it, might require a different mode of negativity than the kind of blanket pessimism that's enforced through untenable analogies. So with that, I'll then thank Jack Halberstam for the gift of this book, with which I and many others will be thinking for years to come.
Thank you very much. And now over to Joe Alvanas.
Okay, thanks so much for everyone tuning in, and to Alan and my fellow panelists, Tavia and Audra, and especially to Jack for giving us this wonderful book and the chance to get together and think with it. Wild Things, the disorder of desire, opens so many new vistas onto questions of politics, sexuality, and culture under its rubric of wildness. And it constellates an eclectic archive that ranges from the art of Kent Monkman and the films of Isaac Julien to the poetry of T.S. Eliot and the fraught, fascinating life of Roger Casement, and to the music of Kate Bush, one of my favorite moments, and much, much more. For Jack, the wild is a force, a desire that pushes us outside in every sense. It constantly threatens to ruin the enclosures of modernity, political, economic, racialized, ecological, sexual. And for this reason, the wild has to be named by and in the modern world as that which has to be overcome for order to prevail. This ambivalence of wildness, its colonial guises and functions, is one of the central issues of the book. But the book invites us to stay with this discomfort and disorder to see what may emerge out of it. It's an unsettling book in the best sense, right? In that it refuses resettlement, including any easy return to the human or to nature. while packed with unexpected case studies and this incredibly eclectic archive. And the case studies are never stripped of their weirdness or wildness, which is something that I really love about this book. At the same time, the book's presented as a lexicon, kind of an expansive conceptual toolbox where the tools are for unbuilding rather than building. Right? And this toolbox and this lexicon, to me, invites new constellations and new disorderings. So in my brief couple minutes, I just want to touch on two responses that the book elicited in me, kind of in that spirit. And the first one has to do with a connection to thinking about the strike, which has been on my mind a lot lately, the general strike. It's also prompted by the massive recent strikes in India, the Hunts Point market strike in New York just this month, and even closer to home, the current tuition strike happening right now at Columbia, which I believe is the largest such strike, I think, in like 50 years or something in the whole country. So thinking with this book and its lexicon, it had me wondering about the wildness of what's known as the wildcat strike. How do strikes partake in wildness and disorder? A wildcat strike is specifically one that is unauthorized by the union leadership. That's what they're known as. So it's acephalic or headless. It's indifferent to leadership that would put it in line. A wildcat strike, by definition, is out of order. It's constitutively illegal and anarchic. It's horizontal. And in its movement can produce new forms of collectivity, joy, desire, and struggle, right? if you're lucky, I think. It's recently been said that we should wildcat the totality. Not just this totality, capitalist modernity that we're in, this whole thing, but the very idea of this whole thing, this world, and what keeps us in it. The wildness of the general strike would be a strike against order and time itself, the time of work, of managed productivity and reproduction. So I think thinking in this direction collides in all kinds of exciting and generative ways with the lexicon and the, if you like, the untoolbox of Wild Things. Okay, this is one of the responses I had when thinking about this book. So another way of saying this, if order is produced and reproduced, wildness, we might say, is generative and generated. So this question of order and time brings me to the second thing I want to touch on. One of the things I love and find so valuable in Jack's book is its insistence on disorder and the limning of the affects and trajectories of this wild terrain. This is so valuable and clarifying because I think we should let them have order, the ones who want it. Wildlife or common life can only ever be disorder to that power, the police, that takes order as its first principle. Let them have law too. We need this generative unsettling of order, this ascent or descent to disorder. If you've seen what happened in the streets in the summer of 2020, in the wake of the George Floyd rebellion and the movement for Black liberation, you know the beauty and the creativity of disorder, and also its terror will always unevenly meted out. And this disorder is felt in a sense of common life beyond the flat, zombified present that we so often seem stuck in. And this is related to what Jack in the book, I think, calls zombie humanism. And I'll note that the figure of the zombie, as has already come up, has this has a kind of essential relation, although an ambivalent one, to Black rebellion, being originally a Haitian word. Right? One of my favorite moments in the book is the reading of the end of Isaac Julian's Looking for Langston. The scene in the film where the cops and the white mob break into the queer nightclub to find only traces of emptiness, a void charged with forms of desire that show up only as fugitive traces, as persisting in another zone of temporality, out of order, and out of the terms of order, to use Cedric Robertson's phrase. The emphasis on time and temporality in Wild Things, the question of when the wild things are, not just where, is really essential, and it's something that will stick with me for a long time from this book. The book's treatment of figures, texts, scenes, and forms of embodiment that limn, quote, a queer relation to temporality itself and refuse a conventional relation to time and space, end quote, is in dialogue with, but also reorients the important work on temporality in queer theory that's been happening in the last couple decades in really exciting ways. Wild time, I might venture, is time that's neither owned nor owed. It's out of order. For order is a temporal concept too, an impulse for a certain proper sequencing and development, right? Putting things in order. In this way, it's a kind of prelude to property. The wild can function, indeed, as I think we'll talk about, as a justification for improvement and enclosure and coloniality, yes, but only in a defensive colonial reaction to what came before, right? Not before as in temporally or developmentally, chronologically, but before the very logics of ordering in this way. This is the excess of the wild, or its disorder and promise, as I see it. There's a lot more to say about that, but being out of time myself, I want to end with Jack's own words from the book's final passage. He writes, quote, "The wild in this book has been a journey out of order. Wildness is neither utopia nor dystopia. It is a force we live with and a way of being that we are organizing out of existence. If the wild has anything to tell us, it is this: unbuild the world you inhabit." Another way of saying this exhilarating last injunction, unbuild the world you inhabit, might be wildcat the totality. Thanks.
Thank you. And now Audra Simpson.
Thanks so much. It's such an honor to be here, to think amongst you, and to reflect upon this very wild book. Jack, I thank you. Jack Halberstam's new book, Wild Things, offers a simultaneous account and analysis of what I'm imagining sometimes as an episteme. It's obviously much more than that, very varied set of ideas that lays off to the side the conceptual and what some have thought of as often territorial place of wildness. A site, and he tells us at times a methodology, a land without borders to sound trite, but really at the end of the book, a field of possibility. In this treatise on wild desire, we are brought through cases where the line that divides life from death, value from unvalue, is collapsed. In the end, in a call for not an aesthetics of unart or disuse or detritus, but instead for political solidarity. The material for this book is itself and could be imagined as an unwieldy, unruly cachet of materials. Ballets, poetry, diaries, large oil paintings, T.S. Eliot, M. Maurice Philippe, Maurice Sendak, the shitting dogs I'm imagining of Brooklyn, knowing Jack's specificity, and their humans sipping lattes, the secret life of pets, chronicles of loneliness and longing, falcons, falconeers, and many critical theorists to move us along the way. The argument here, resting and moving through these cases that comprise the particular archive, is that wildness is its own site of liberatory disorder. And it's quartering off not only from what is tame, and in this, of course, we might first go to imagined as civilized, but what is normatively embodied, normatively sexed, what is biologically determined, what is easily contained in either, or never easily contained, but imagined to be easily contained in either colonial taxonomies of difference and order, then becomes, in this elaborate argument, a site of the juxtaposition, but also wild imagining and possibility. It is hard not to read this as a location, as a place of sorts. In order to get you there, you sometimes, though, are placed there literally and empirically. I'm going to sound like an annoying empiricist. You are placed there by law, by the police, the evolutionary biologist, or the sexologist's pen or imagination. They're deeply negating versions of this placement beyond even carcerality or with carcerality, the kind that use the definition of wild or savage to place you away from your family on an auction block, to render your land or water like property, you as property, as not human, as not worthy of recognition as human. That is a movement to wild that is fundamentally not liberatory and is lived still in the afterlives of slavery, in the afterlives of dispossession, accounting for the differential forms of flourishing accorded to some, partially accomplished with recourse to this definitional toolkit: human, not human, white, black, race, colonized, over there, always away, where the wild things are. For Native people, for Black people, this wildness as a category of apprehension has been a curse and a cause for incarceration, misapprehension, outright theft of land, theft of labor. To be recognized as an Indian at one point in Canada was to be defined as to live in a savage state on the land, in a different language. Perhaps we can add something like by the chase, although it was not the language of law. But it was in the law to be known in this way. And so it was that some white men were recognized as Indian because they lived like Indians in a savage state by the chase. That lasted for 1 year before the Proto-Indian Act amended and was amended and the logics of biology, or rather more specifically, blood, hemmed them out. And it was the Indian women who married them that became not wild and lost their Indian status for marrying out and marrying into civilization, effectively leaving their state of nature and entering civilization as the like property wives of their white husbands. No longer Indian, but brown. They were also then without Indian status and lost then the right to live on their reserves, to hunt on in their territories. Their children lost those rights as well, and they would be escorted off their reservations for trespass if they were to visit their families. They could be arrested, needless to say, for trespass. I leave this heteropatriarchal and sex legal case of journeying away from wildness, from savagery, to turn to the case of a different sort of journeying, away from domesticity to the voluntary, albeit punished, and aspirational trip of Max, in Where the Wild Things Are. A different century, a different kind of person, a different sort of text, where we can see one's punishment and loneliness turn to a place of otherworldliness, and Max's own dominion over the wild things, a site of wild sovereignty. The course of this journey or method and the processes laid with these cases in Halberstam's book, and these cases, Halberstam tells us at several points, is limbed with queerness. But a queerness, he reminds us also, that at times seems irretrievable or indecipherable as indicators. And here I'm thinking of the reading we just heard of Langston Hughes's life via Isaac Julian, that may not appear in ways that are recognizable to contemporary readers as queer. Julian offers instead what Jack Halberstam describes as a representational maelstrom, in which queerness, along though with white normativity, disappears into the night, Jack tells us. Taking up Brent Edwards's discussion of the vexation of trying to account for meaning with archival fragments, and of course, Idea Hartman's organizing framework of wayward, both to account for and address the problem of the archive, always impartial for some, actually probably for everybody. Hughes's life and its evidentiary traces may or may not organize itself or to readers under the sign of homosexual, and he may not in fact have wanted it to do so. Hughes's intent sometimes aside, Halberstam places his Wild Nights in Harlem within the method and a disordered and ferocious treatise on the wildness within. Now, the more recent 21st century Cree with a C painter and performance artist, Kent Monkman, stands in Labutin Heels aside Hughes as both a figure of something and a maker of things. Halberstam argues of indigenous bewilderment, one who is rephrasing the representational art of the master, so to speak, and as Jack pointed to in his opening comments, to modernity itself, to speak with subversive scenes of sex sequestered in the landscape painters of the high settler colonial period. I called it the high settler colonial period. It is modernity, right? Modernism, sorry. Only with Indians on top, right? And I say that nudge, nudge, wink, wink, yes, top that way, on top. See that art. This is cleverly smuggled counter history, a cleverly smuggled counter history of desire, but is one that is harnessed as well to a long-term project on art history itself, flipping again the script on who is on top and what the message within portends. Like Hughes, I would say Monkman stands in a strange position vis-a-vis an expected, and here I'm invoking, yes, Silva Loria's notion of expectation, history of queer utterances, in that the work is so obviously informed, I read it this way, and Jack and I will talk about this either now or later, by a hyper-awareness of what is expected. Both the savagery of indigeneity and the savagery of queer romance and sex. Monkman's bewilderment, I read as an enchantment, I would argue, with Western art form. I think Jack reads this very differently, and what the mastery of that form advances. So in order to smuggle the surprise of overt, staggeringly queer sex and recognizably queer forms and figures, like the ostentatious mischief eagle testicle, this is achieved through the medium. This of high art. This has offered Monkman power and entree into mainstream circles. Please go see his work at the Met if you will, but has also allowed him to stop smuggling and now render other stories, like The Scream, which Jack discusses. This is, however, a different world than that of Baldwin, a different time, and Monkman also simultaneously wears the drag, perhaps, of a cis native man, one that is differently positioned in the order of things than even a cis native woman. And here I'm not losing sight of the range of gendered possibilities in native life or non-indigenous life. So the wildness is definitely more than gestural, but it also contains itself in a way that I think allows for, again, this sort of performance of enchantment, a smuggling project that archives now near contemporary instances of an ongoing colonialism. Something that's not very sexy, right? That's not very titillating, that doesn't speak to his queer publics the way the earlier work did. Rendering, as Halberstam discusses in The Scream, imaged as the polyphonic scene of children being torn from their mothers by the state. The men in those red coats are the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This was and is the horror, the menacing and venal wild of Canadian settler colonialism. I have so much to ask Jack about animals and about the liberatory disorder of life promised or hoped for at the end of the book, and I want to limn my own question with matter again from indigenous or indigenous political life, one that has been worked upon and defiled by colonial governments that first wanted land or sometimes water and then came for people, children, and minds. We have also learned from historians like Bobby Etheridge, Andres Rezandez, the sometimes anthropologist, sometimes historian, autobiographical writer Deborah Miranda, of the terrible legacy also of Indian enslavement, rarely mentioned in mainstream accounts of history that afflicted Native families and polities as well, as people were moved before and with Africans to theaters of labor in the Bahamas and elsewhere. So we join each other indeed, as Jack tells us, in different ways in these undead taxonomies of brutal differentiation and indentured negation, sometimes under the sign of the wild or the non-human, the child, the animal, the savage, etc. When I think of animals, though, I want to press on animals, and this is an undeveloped thought, but I just want to invite Jack and others to think with me on this, is as animals as ordering principles rather than signs or symptoms of disorder. As they organize for some, and we learn this over and over again from hunters, Cree hunters and the like, they organize for some, actually many indigenous peoples, they organize relations to family, to water, they hold knowledge, they transmit it, and so are killed or not killed differently, are respected, are themselves repository of knowledge, etc. they can seem anything then. They can seem not so wild, I want to say. And I'll simply leave it at that. I enjoyed this book very much, Jack. I learned so much, and I'll be thinking with you and your archive and my fellow panelists for a long time to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Audra. And before I ask Jack to respond to any of these points, just a reminder, this would be a very good time to put your question in the Q&A box if you wish to ask a question. If you want to ask it live, just put the word live in somewhere, and we'll see how many we can fit in. But Jack, do you have any response to these?
Well, wow. First of all, thank you so much for these responses to what is a kind of, I want to say deliberately, but who knows, disorganized book, in the sense that a wild archive cannot, by definition, be a set of texts that obviously just sort of interlock and one leads to the next. It's not at all obvious going in that when we start talking about Rite of Spring, we'll end up with zombies, and that is both, a strength of the book probably, but also it's also where it can completely collapse. There's a lot happening. So I really appreciate the way in which each response has sort of brought to the fore a central rubric in the book that maybe leads to potentially some contradictory claims. And that is a problem with Wildness. Its history, as Audra just laid out for us, is not pretty. It's not, you just have to think about the term wilding and the way in which it was used, for example, in relationship to the Central Park 5, as if this was, oh yeah, we know exactly what this means. Wilding means young Black men running around potentially raping people. So the category has almost entered into various lexicons of white supremacy unchallenged. So the task, in a way, and Tavia and I found this when we put together a South Atlantic Quarterly edition on Wildness, the task is to try to make the term do some of the work that is available without simply returning to the logics that underpin it. And I think Audra's comment just laid out how difficult that can be, and how of necessity you will fail in trying to do this. There's a way in which wildness cannot be rehabilitated. Tavia was saying something similar in a way in relationship to Blackness. And I think I hear it as a kind of really smart caution about entering into some of these conversations about Afro-pessimism using the category of wildness. And yes, in the way that Blackness within Afro-pessimism cannot be analogized to anything, and therefore, and also must not simply be collapsed into darkness, it becomes quite difficult then to make it do the kind of work that I want it to do in my book. But the place where I join forces, if you like, with some strands of Afro-pessimism, which, as Tavia makes clear, has very little to do with the kind of Heideggerian Lacanian strand of negativity, is in that sense of unmaking the world. Like here we are clearly in a world crafted by civilizational discourses on the one hand, white supremacy on the other. And it's never been clearer in some senses than now that this world must go. And that's the version of Afro-pessimism that I think I was trying to join forces with, the sort of Frank Wilderson, no slave, no world, the version of world that depends upon the savagery of the indigenous person and the enslavement of the Black person is the world that must go. And then the question is, how do we unbuild it? And are there clues available to us in the discourses that have been used violently to classify and enclose people? Are there clues in those discourses like Wildness about how to do this? And I think Joe was able to attach to that aspiration of the book with this great category of the wildcat strike the unauthorized version, if you like, of rebellion, of protest, not unauthorized as in what we saw January 6th in the Capitol, because of course that was authorized, that was not chaotic, that was not disorder, that was something that had been planned with the FBI, with the police, and with full support of the powers that be. So this other form of rebellion that we want to associate, and I think Joe and I sort of agree on this orientation towards disorder for a political project is one that builds off of some of the shards of what civilizational culture has rejected, has refused, and has discarded. And it's through these, this kind of salvage project that we can potentially find our way to a different kind of lexicon. Final point. I love what you were saying, Audra, about as you sit there with, I don't know if it's a cat or a dog, something, animal. Of course, like animals have had many different household functions in different communities, but the version of the pet that we've settled upon that is part of a kind of industrial investment in family animal intimacy is the one that is sort of the target of my wrath, precisely because there's a sense that we are touching the animal, we are close to the animal, we are helping the animal, rescuing the animal when we bring it into our household. And in fact, the opposite is the case. It is the place where the wild goes to die, is when you bring the wild into your family space and then, farm out the labor of walking it to somebody else and feed it wretched pellets or whatever. So I'm also amazed at how attached people are to the sense of themselves as good in relationship to this particular relationship to the animal. And the book also explores why we're so invested in our intimacies with these animals while drawing the line against sex with the animal. And it's that boundary that seems to me to hold within it the possibility of thinking more wildly in relationship to human-animal intimacy. So, Alan, I'm happy to let you, unless somebody wants to respond to that, I'm happy to.
Maybe, we've had several questions about pets.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
As you might expect. So I'll just bring a couple of these. One asks, I was wondering if the book engages with pet owning in terms of its history, location, and context, and particularly in terms of the development of breeds, the continuation of these breeds despite the health issues they face. Are these animals products of our domestication, while those of mixed breed are in a way returning to the wildness that was stripped from them, even if they are again domesticated? And another question from Jenny Davidson about in an area where there is massive invasive feral cat population, how does her tending of a semi-feral foster kitten fit into the conceptual scheme? How should she understand it other than I selfishly like doing it, which I think is where you'd just come to in your own remarks.
Yeah, well, I do think that breeding is part of this larger context of domestication, the way in which the pet has gone from being an animal in which we have an interest to being a commodity that we own and then that we breed in order to get the version of the animal that we like and breed out the version of the animal that we don't like. And I do go to town a little bit on the idea of a companion species in Haraway, which, I know is really, it's kind of, suicidal to go up against Haraway, because of course I actually am very, very influenced by Haraway, but I think that this fantasy of a companion species is just that. I mean, that this is not a mutual relationship in any way, shape, or form. And the training that we insist upon in relationship to the animal, whether it's potty training or any other kind, is, evidence of this kind of sovereign relationship that we hold over the animal. In that sense, Jenny's question about her feral cat, I mean, I guess I would just pass back to Jenny. You know, what is the desire to own the feral cat? I mean, what was so interesting in the T.H. White book on the goshawk is that he precisely wants to be in relationship to something that is untamable. That's the, you know, that's where the libido is in that text. So I'm, you know, interested in why we want to train the feral out of the animals with which we choose to, you know, make companionship.
Great. Since you just brought in Kestrel at the end there, Eliza Zingesser has an interesting question about, could you speak more about the genders of the falcons or hawks beloved by the authors?
Yeah.
So it's usually female birds of prey who are used in falconry and hawking because of their larger size. But at least in Romance languages, they are usually gendered male linguistically via species names. So do these authors think in terms of gender for these birds, or are they genderqueer for them?
They're not genderqueer. Helen MacDonald's hawk that she trains is very clearly a female hawk. I think she calls it Mabel. And T.H. White's goshawk, I believe a goshawk is male. And I, you know, this then becomes the relay back and forth between him and his goshawk that he is very unsuccessful in training is kind of compared in a way by Helen MacDonald to his relationship to the young boys he teaches, as similarly a kind of sadomasochistic dynamic. And I think actually the gender of the birds are quite important. I think in Kestrel for a Knave, the idea is that the kestrel is the young boy, and his taming of the bird is him also coming under the sway of a kind of, you know, bourgeois domestication himself.
We have a question from Kayama Glover. Can we take that one live? Is that possible? We have to patch you in somehow.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Hi, sorry, I'm sorry to be the outlier here speaking into the void. I have to make dinner at the same time as I'm watching this talk, but thank you so much, Jack, for this book, and thank you for this panel that really touched on what I wanted to ask, but I'm hoping you can elaborate a bit further on this question of boundaries, the boundaries and the borders of wildness as spatially contingent and therefore steeped in real politics, right? So you've opened the door to the zombie, but you've kept this figure in the North American, US kind of entertainment context for the most part, at least in this talk. I haven't gotten to the final chapter yet of the book. So I suppose I'm interested, you know, having extracted this figure from its contemporary lived context, Haiti in particular, whether we can talk a bit about, you know, what we do to keep the wildness out in our mainstream politics and in our ways of thinking about otherness and brownness in particular, and third worldness even more specifically. And I'm thinking in the wake of the shithole country and the border wall, etc. You know, just some of your thoughts on those particular material as opposed to more metaphorical elements of wildness in this world.
Thank you so much for that question. And I mean, I think you can tell that the book is not, it's not a geopolitical exploration of wildness. It doesn't, although, you know, hearing Audra speak, I'm thinking, wow, you could do this incredible sort of historical genealogy of wildness. It is much more interested in not just the metaphorics of wildness, but the way in which wildness is at the edges of many of the kind of political formations that we have been, you know, we are the result of, and that it's within probably a whole set of these foundational discourses that, precisely because they are not articulated, do all kinds of work beneath the surface of manifest political discourse. the zombie, just as an example, is used all over the place. I mean, there's like 15 anthologies on the zombie. There are zombie economies, there are zombie governments, there are zombie populations, there are zombie apartment buildings. David Harvey uses this term to talk about apartment buildings that are left empty within zombie capitalism, you know. So I actually am talking about the aesthetic, conceptual, and the aesthetic function, if you like, of wildness. In relationship to the zombie, though, I do talk about the way in which the zombie becomes a figure within American popular culture, precisely by a fantasy of what the zombie is in the context of Haiti. And the early zombie films were all about Haiti. That misrecognizes the fact that in Haitian culture, the zombie is the fantasy of an enslaved person, that they will die and still be enslaved. And what how will slavery ever be escaped? And I try to look at the way in which this logic of zombieism makes its way through American popular culture. And I spend a lot of time, for example, on Night of the Living Dead, which is an extraordinary film from 1968 that in many ways is a protest film in which, and the guy who plays the lone Black survivor of a zombie apocalypse was the first lead actor, Black lead actor in an American popular film. And of course, in Night of the Living Dead, he's sequestered with a group of white people in a farmhouse, and one by one, the white people die. And at the end, when dawn comes, the police arrive, and he's like, hey, I've survived. He leaves the house, and the police see him as a zombie and shoot him. So this collapsing of the zombie into the figure of the Black man is, in fact, a powerful statement about both white supremacy at that moment and about protest culture and the inability to recognize protest culture as a kind of powerful response. So I do dig into the Haitian roots, probably not at all in that materialist way that you're proposing, but mostly yes, to find out how the zombie has entered in as a kind of obsessive site within contemporary American popular culture.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Could you speak to desire and disorder and its rejection of the normative in relation to metronormativity stroke urban anti-urbanity and queer ecologies stroke nature?
Desire and disorder, its rejection of the normative in relationship to metronormativity. Yeah, I mean, I am quite interested in queer ecologies, but I also have a bit of a critique in the book of queer ecology as a kind of holding within it a new moralism or a kind of moralistic set of assumptions about what the relationship to nature should be. There's almost a kind of back to nature, let's get closer to nature imperative within queer ecologies. And I know that that's not how most of this material is meant, but I do survey some of the literature on queer ecology that imagines that, if you just get closer to animals, for example, that you will unlock, like some weird video game, you will unlock a better way of being in the world. And I don't think that that is at all what the pursuit of wildness offers. Just put it out there. And for the reasons that Audra and Tavia in particular have given, wildness is not to be the new inspirational utopian project. It's more looking at some of the logics that hold political aspiration in place and trying to uncouple some of the relationships between dominant discourse and subordinate discourses in the way that, for example, Kent Monkman's work does, and not for, you know, moral purposes, not in order to say there are better ways to be, but more on behalf of what Joe was talking about, trying to dig into the possibility of a politics built upon disorder, and that does not recruit the law to its cause.
Thank you very much. And I think we should draw things to a close. I have a feeling we could go on talking for a very, very long time about this. So Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, from Duke University Press, 30% off if you use the code that's in the chat. I'm shameless. It's a E20 Wild is the code from the Duke University Press website. I want to thank all our panelists today, Tavia Nyong'o, Joe Alvanas and Aldridge Simpson, and especially to Jack Halberstam for this evening and for giving us this great book. Thank you all for coming, stay warm, and we'll see you again soon.